this is a very rich topic, a topic that there's so many different things to say about. So what I'd like to do today is to, first of all, trouble you a little bit, and then really upset you, and then hopefully sort of draw you back into thinking that maybe this guy has a point anyways, even though a lot of what he's saying is obviously bizarrely exaggerated and could not possibly be true. So, starting with the topic of fatness and identity politics, the notion of fat as a political issue, I think, is still very unusual to people. It sounds very counterintuitive that fat could be a political issue. Susie Orbach 30 years ago suggested that fat was a feminist issue, an idea which I think has become almost platitudinous in a way, but as Professor Saguy indicates, has perhaps been seriously under-theorized in a variety of ways. Feminism is famous for proclaiming that the personal is the political, and certainly I think that's nowhere more true than in the context of arguments about and struggles over body weight in American culture today. Now what I'd like to do today is first of all lay out why I think we're in the grip of a moral panic on the issue of weight in America, and then make an analogy to another area of social contention that is, I think, usefully compared to the moral panic that we're having over weight, and especially to the question of the kind of cures that are being put forward for the supposed health crisis that we're facing because of the fattening of America. Now, I should preface this with the usual academic caveats about analogies being limited by their very nature, as strict logicians will point out. To say A is like B is always going to be to some extent false, given that A is not B. So there's going to be ways in which these analogies are not perfect. If you wish to dismiss what I'm saying by pointing out that what I'm saying is not perfectly analogous, feel free, because you will certainly have many opportunities to do that. But that being said, I do think analogy in this kind of a context can be particularly powerful because it can cause people to think about things in ways that they otherwise would not have considered. So, beginning, first of all, well, let me say a couple words first about how I got into this business in the first place. I'm a law professor and a lawyer by training, and so our people, naturally, especially doctors, are often curious as to why I am haranguing them about their mistaken views on the relationship between body weight and health. I got into this originally because there was a president of the United States named Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and he had a liaison with a woman named Monica Lewinsky, and I was doing a conference on the impeachment of Bill Clinton at that time, and I discovered that there seemed to be a tremendous amount of anxiety in the culture about the fact that Monica Lewinsky was quote-unquote fat. And there was a tremendous amount of discussion of that in the literature. I couldn't understand it. And I was doing a conference and I had to fill in a gap in the program when a speaker dropped out, and so I was going to talk about media coverage. And so I just did a Lexis search, an online search, and I put in the search terms Lewinsky and Zoftig, because I noticed the word Zoftig. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know what the word Zoftig means? Maybe 10–15%. There are many socioeconomic determinants, I think, of knowing what Zoftig means. Zoftig is a Yiddishism. It's from the German word for juicy. And originally it meant a curvaceous and therefore erotically desirable woman. But through semantic drift, it became a euphemism for fat. So to call a woman Zoftig was essentially just a polite way of saying she was fat. And so I was wondering, why are all these stories signaling that Monica Lewinsky is quote-unquote fat, and also, by the way, not coincidentally, Jewish? What's going on there? Especially given that the vast majority of Americans have no idea what the word Zoftig means, and yet there was more than 100 stories that used the term Zoftig in describing Monica Lewinsky. So anyways, that's how I got into it in the first place. And then there's a really long story as in regard to how I found that, and this sounds like a wild exaggeration, but I tell you it is true, Bill Clinton got impeached because Monica Lewinsky was a yo-yo dieter. That is literally true. And to find out how that's literally true, you have to look at the obesity myth. But, so, well, I'll just bracket that for the moment. That's how I got into it. And when I was getting to the subject initially, I was just going to talk about fat anxiety in the context of the Clinton presidency, and like most people of my background, I just assumed that it was true that being fat was really bad for you from a health perspective, and I wasn't really questioning that at all. But then I started looking at the evidence and found that the case for that proposition was very poorly supported, actually. So much so that it could be analogized to a lot of other panics that we have in society over risks that are either small, such as smoking marijuana, or non-existent, such as being subjected to satanic abuse while you are a preschooler, which probably some of you, if I can do my math here, some of you at least may have actually been preschoolers. I hope none of you were subjected to satanic abuse at that time. But there was, in the 1980s in the United States, a huge panic over satanic ritual abuse in our preschools, believe it or not. There was one of the, probably the most famous trial that took place regarding this, happened right here in Los Angeles, the Mcmartin Trial. It was all nonsense, essentially. It was, I'm not saying that no preschooler has ever been subjected to satanic abuse, but what happened was that there was the claim that there were hundreds of cases of this all around the United States. And what it really turned on was essentially anxieties about women going into the paid workforce, and the satanic ritual abusers essentially imagined in the preschools were the sort of folk devils of this moral panic that we were having. So anyways, it turns out that the fat panic we're having in America is largely like that. It's largely like reefer madness. It's largely like satanic ritual abuse in our preschools. It's largely like 153 communists in the State Department, Joe McCarthy waving his piece of paper. It's largely like crack babies who will become super criminals. I'm sure some of you will, if you haven't already, encountered these social phenomena as you study moral panics in a variety of social science contexts. So to get to the nitty-gritty of why we're having, or how it is that we're having a panic over fat in the culture, let me just assert a few things for sort of plentiful statistical demonstration of the things that I'm saying. You can check the obesity myth. First of all, the correlation between weight and health is actually fairly weak, except at real statistical extremes. If you look at very thin people, who are, by the way, rarely talked about in this context, and extremely fat people, you do see some kind of significant correlation between health risk and weight, but you really have to be looking at fairly extreme subgroups of the population. For the vast majority of people, essentially for 100% of the people who are classified as overweight in our culture, and for most of the people who are classified as obese in our culture, you have these four categories. Underweight, never talked about, and almost impossible for any human being to achieve without like starvation, in other words, fashion models and Hollywood actresses. Then normal weight, which means thinner than me, and seriously, and then overweight, which is me, and 80% of other middle-aged American men, by the way, at least overweight or obese, and then obese, which is like the really fat category. Well, anyways, there's no increased risk associated with overweight whatsoever, and in fact, the highest, I should say, the lowest mortality risk and the longest life expectancy is found in the overweight category. So that's as phony a category as you can get. The obese category, most people in the obese category do not have increased mortality risk associated with their weight, although very, very fat people do. So the correlation between weight and health risk in general and mortality risk in particular is weak and tremendously exaggerated in the literature. Second, as I'm sure many of you have already discovered by being introduced to the concept of the relationship between correlation and causation, correlation is not the same thing as causation. The fact that you see some correlation between body weight and health risk at statistical extremes does not mean that the body weight is causing the health risk. It's associated with it, but that's a different matter. There's all kinds of reasons why there might be a correlation that it does not necessarily mean it's causal. If you'll find that people who have yellow teeth have a stratospherically higher rate of developing lung cancer in the United States than people who don't. That does not mean that teeth whitening is going to greatly reduce the risk of contracting lung cancer for reasons that I'm sure you can all figure out for yourselves. The confounding variables that might lead to people who are significantly heavier than average having increased health risk rather than the weight itself are plentiful. Let me just name a few. Lower socioeconomic status, which is strongly associated with higher weight in the culture. The fatter you are, the more likely you are to be poor, and being poor is in general pretty bad for your health for all kinds of reasons in the United States, not the least of which being that we have a highly dysfunctional healthcare system, at least for people who are not in an economically privileged situation. Another reason why people who are significantly heavier than average might have increased health risk is dieting. Dieting is, in general, pretty bad for people's health. Specifically, what's harmful to people's health is weight fluctuation, is so-called yo-yo dieting, and which is the outcome of a significant percentage of diet attempts. What people do is they lose weight and then they gain it back, and in at least a third of cases more. So what the effect that you get is the studies that have looked at this have all found either that there is a risk associated with weight fluctuation, or there's no effect. There are no studies that show that there's a positive outcome to weight fluctuation, which strongly suggests that weight fluctuation is per se bad for all kinds of reasons. It's strongly associated with increased congestive heart failure and with hypertension and with other bad things as well. So dieting, which is the cure, of course, for the obesity epidemic, it may very well be actually the cause of the health risks associated, or the cause of many of the health risks associated with fatness. Another thing that's very bad for people's health is stress. I can feel the stress in this room right now. It's just very uncomfortable to talk about this subject because people, and by people I mean women in this culture, are basically largely uncomfortable with their bodies in regard to, oh, thank you. Are we already 30 minutes into this?
No, it's 30 more minutes.
Oh.
And then I'll give you 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you. Better speed up now. I'm being a little bit facetious, and I don't wish to be facetious because this is a sensitive subject, but this is an extraordinarily gendered subject. I mean, just take a look around, right? Why am I getting to talk the way I am about this kind of thing, even though I'm quote-unquote overweight, which I am, according to the American government? Because A, I'm a man, and there's a second reason, but I can't remember what it is. Mainly because I'm a man, right? And therefore I have, because even though I'm overweight, I'm thin. Right? I'm thin in terms of the social meaning of thinness in our culture. A man of my particular social class and background and so forth is typed as thin. And therefore, even though I'm quote-unquote overweight, I have a BMI of 25 and change. I'm 5'8", I weigh 167 pounds, and that makes me overweight, according to the US government. I am still socially thin, so I'm a man, so I get to say whatever I want about weight and not be judged for it because nobody cares what men weigh. Needless to say, I am painting with a very broad brush here. Okay, so yes, weight discrimination definitely affects men, and it's not as if this kind of craziness does not have negative effects on men too. It certainly does, but it has a vastly stronger effect on women, as I'm sure many of you can recognize from just your own life experience. So I'm a man, I can say what I want about weight without being judged by it for it. And secondly, I'm thin. If I was a woman and I was 5'8" and 167 pounds, I would not be thin, even though I would have exactly the same body mass, even though I would physiologically, I have the same BMI, body mass index, but socially I would be, in this context at least, upper class, privileged institution of higher learning, I would be fat. And therefore, of course, I would not have standing to say anything about this. Because obviously, quote unquote, I would be rationalizing for my own failure to have maintained an appropriate body type. So, stress, right? We're stressing about this right now, talking about it. That's bad for our health. So this whole exercise is, at least as a short-term matter, bad for your health. It's going to be good for your health in the long term, so it's worth it right now to feel some stress to talk about this very uncomfortable subject. So the correlation between weight and health is weak. Causation in regard to that correlation is very poorly established, essentially not established at all, because epidemiology is really a crude science, and it's just impossible to control rigorously for the kind of confounders that we would want to be able to control for to say anything really definitive about the subject. Third, and this is the part that never ever gets acknowledged by people who know better, even though they will acknowledge it and then just renounce it, they acknowledge it a split second later, we can't make people thin. Okay? There's no empirical proposition in medicine that is better established than this. There is no known way to produce significant long-term weight loss in a statistically significant population. Just don't know how to do it. And that includes weight loss surgery or stomach amputation. That does not produce significant long-term weight loss among most people who undergo it. Certainly what absolutely fails completely in terms of significant long-term weight loss is haranguing people about their weight and telling them that if they ate right and exercised more, they would be thin. For the vast majority of people, that prescription is a complete failure. Now, it's hopefully relatively rare in medicine in particular and social policy in general to keep pursuing an intervention which is demonstrably a failure over and over again. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's just another word for dieting. Right? There's a very well done study here, right here at UCLA about 3 years ago, authored by I believe Tracy Mann and others, which had really produced really excellent data for the question of how well do diet programs work. And the answer is they don't. Right? This is one of these things that it's sort of inchoately known by many people, but was really rigorously demonstrated in this study, and very usefully so. So even if it were true that the correlation between weight and health was strong, even if it were true that the causation between that is putatively a product of that correlation had been well established, which it hasn't. Even if all that were true, it still would not make sense to pursue weight loss as a public health intermediation, given that we don't know how to produce it. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking right now, well, I just know that's not true in my case. Right? Because it may be true en masse, so to speak, but it's not true for me. Right? Because I know that if I just did X, Y, and Z, I would weigh 5 pounds less, or 10 pounds less, or 20 pounds less, or 50 pounds less than I weigh right now, which is what I should be doing. But I shouldn't have had that little something or the other when I walked in. But it was right there, and it looked good, and I was kind of hungry, and but I'll go to the gym for 3 hours tomorrow because I ate a piece of cheese. It's bad. We can't make people thin. Maybe you're the exception. There are exceptions, of course. There are exceptions to everything, as I will get to in another context in a minute. But in general, we can't make people thin. So think about this. Given that our attempts to make people thin are not only failures, but also positively harmful in all kinds of ways, both physiologically and psychologically, and given then finally, the final point I'd like to emphasize here, that thinness is absolutely not necessary for health, what sense does it have to have a social policy, as we do in the United States right now, based on the notion that we ought to be trying to make people thinner for the purposes of improving their health? The answer is, that's a rhetorical question, no sense at all. In fact, it's a form of, I know sociologists don't like this kind of phraseology, and for a good reason, but it's basically crazy. Right? It's just a kind of cultural madness on the loose. And one of the great things about sociology as a field is that it allows one to consider that today's indubitable scientific truth, confirmed by the very best and highest authorities and consensus panels all over the world, and in mission statements of the World Health Organization, and by your mother, and like all the top authority figures, that all those things which are today, one of those truths that we hold to be self-evident, thin good, fat bad, right, is tomorrow's unbelievable nonsense that you just can't understand how anybody could have believed that. We see this over and over again in the history of science, in the history of medicine, in society in general. And it's my belief, I don't know when, it could be tomorrow, it could be 50 years from now, we will look back on the current orientation towards weight in this culture and health as a form of social craziness, similar to the way that lots of people, although unfortunately not our legal system, look at things like reefer madness today, or satanic ritual abuse in our preschools. Which again, I have to assure you, was a really big deal 25 years ago. So that's the thesis. That's the situation, I think. And now I'd like to draw an analogy to another controversial topic, which I think is usefully comparable in various ways, although different in others, of course, to the situation with fat panic in America today. And here I need to say a little something about terminology. The word fat is almost like a verbal assault in this culture right now. You can't even say it. It's without causing people to I do that to obesity researchers all the time. It drives me crazy. It's like, what do you have against fat? And it's like, saying fat is like saying one of those words that you're just not supposed to say to people. I noticed in the context of the Clinton-Lewinsky thing that people flinched a lot less at semen-stained dress than they did at fat. I could say semen-stained dress to my mother, and she'd be like, okay with it. Not crazy about it, but like she'd be okay with it. But fat is like, oh my God, you have to use that word. But I think it's important to use the word because as Marilyn Wan, who you all have to come to her talk a month from now, because Marilyn Wan makes me look like Miss Manners in regard to talking about this stuff. And she's, a super powerful and important and brilliant speaker. As Marilyn Wan has reminded us over and over again, fat is what fat people are. It's a descriptor. It's like, it should be, it isn't, but it should be a neutral physical descriptor in this culture. I was trying to come up with neutral physical descriptors, but given our neurosis about bodies in this culture, it's kind of hard to come up with a purely neutral physical descriptor. But something like, I don't know, I can't come up with even one, but something like, she has freckles. I think, maybe, I don't know. But I was going to use, like, you can't use tall, because tall is very positive in the context of a male frame, right? Short is bad, right? You can't use old, obviously, or young, or anything like that, but you get the idea. The point is, fat should be just a physical descriptor. You should just be saying, oh, it's the kid with the red hair over there. Oh, that's the fat kid over there. Oh, you laugh and you think, oh, that's just absurd. Why is that absurd? Well, it's absurd because it's an insult to call somebody fat. Why is it an insult to call somebody fat? Because being fat is considered a disease and a morally degraded status in this culture. And therefore, to call somebody fat is to call them sick and to call them essentially vicious as opposed to virtuous in some way. You have a disease and you could cure yourself of this disease if you tried hard enough. And therefore, it's an insult to call you fat. As Marilyn and many others have pointed out, that's not the way it ought to be. We ought to talk about fat as fat. And what we should not talk about is obesity. I hated using that word as the title of my book, but in the end decided, actually I didn't decide, the publisher decided that it was necessary. Why shouldn't we be talking about obesity? Why should we not use the words obesity and overweight? Because those words are begging the question. Those words are tainted semantic markers of a pathological state. You can't, so you have to deal with nonsense questions all the time, like, how can you say it's healthy to be overweight? Because a lot of doctors, to them, it's just like, that's like saying, how can you say it's healthy to be sick? I don't get that. Sounds like a nonsense statement to me. Well, because the word overweight is a fraudulent term. It's a junk science, pure and simple. So we shouldn't be calling people overweight or obese. We should be calling them fat, because that's what fat people are. I'm not fat right now, but in certain social contexts I would be. If I was a 20-year-old gay man in Santa Monica, I might be fat. I'm not really sure. If I was a woman, I'm quite sure I would be fat at this height and weight in this particular social context, as I was saying earlier. Well, language is important, and that brings me to my analogy, which I've been creeping up to. And the analogy is this. Let us think about the parallels between the conceptualization of body weight as a pathological state, so that right now 68% of the American population between the ages of 20 and 59, according to the very latest statistics which were published this week, are either overweight or obese, according to these categories, including yours truly, with the concept of sexual orientation as being a potential disease state or a morally vicious tendency. In other words, let us think about the parallel between thinking of fatness as a pathological disease and or moral failing, and the notion of same-sex sexual orientation as being a pathological condition, a mental disorder or disease, and a morally degraded state. As I'm sure many of you know, until relatively recently in medical history, and in American medical history in particular, that's exactly the way that same-sex sexual orientation was treated. Until 1973, what was called homosexuality was officially a mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it was only removed after a terrific fight with only 58% of the members of the American Psychiatric Association at that time agreeing that it ought to be removed, and that was not that long ago. The parallel I want to draw here then is essentially fat gay versus obese homosexual. So this is not a perfect parallel by any means, but the word homosexual was, at least for a long time, a word that was inherently semantically weighted with the notion of pathology. It's a mental disorder or a disease state. The word gay was an attempt by activists to take back the notion of same-sex sexual orientation from the doctors and the psychiatrists. In the same way that fat activists today are trying to take the word fat back from the doctors, and the psychiatrists, and most of all, the weight loss companies and the pharmaceutical industry, who is just waiting to sell you their biggest new diet drug right now, to take that word back and to say, no, it's not a disease. It's not a pathology. It is a natural variation in human populations that you see everywhere. And the notion that somehow everybody in this country would have a body mass of between 18.5 and 24.9, officially sanctioned as normal by the public health authorities of the United States, the notion that everyone would be within that weight range if everyone had a quote-unquote healthy lifestyle is nonsense. What that means, by the way, to put it in concrete terms, for an average height woman is to weigh between 108 and 144 pounds. That's what you're allowed to weigh and be normal in the United States right now. I'm not in that normal range. I'm fat. Of course, I'm not fat socially. I'm fat according to the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health and the International Obesity Task Force, funded by your good friends at Bristol Myers Squibb and Glaxo, I forget the other one, two of the big pharmaceuticals that are funding the research that pathologizes 68% of the population. Well, fat, gay versus homosexual versus obese homosexual on the other side. Now, today there has been, over the course of the last generation, there's an enormous shift in the notion that same-sex sexual orientation is a disease state or a morally depraved or degraded situation, of course. However, that idea is far from dead. And in fact, in many culturally conservative contexts in the United States, it's so far from dead that there is a practice of so-called conversion therapy that you can find among certain mental health practitioners and also lay pastoral people to turn homosexual individuals, to use the terminology that they would use, into people who have a heterosexual sexual orientation. This is referred to more generally as conversion therapy. Particular versions of it are sometimes called reparative therapy. One of the most, I think, influential within this subculture, although a subculture that is very derided now by the mainstream medical authorities who were saying exactly the same thing 15 minutes ago, but now are, of course, just saying, oh, it's just complete nonsense that anybody thinks that this is possible. One of the most sort of comprehensive treatments of this is by Joseph Nicolozi's reparative therapy of the male homosexual, published a few years ago. And he has a key concept, and that's the concept of the non-gay homosexual. Now, given the language that I just used, that statement can begin, I think, to make a certain amount of sense. Right? The non-gay who is the non-gay homosexual? This is a man who, according to Nicolozi, experiences same-sex desire but does not want to identify as gay. Gay is a, quote, contemporary socio-political identity and lifestyle, unquote. It is, he says, that the non-gay homosexual is a man who experiences a split between his value system and his sexual orientation. He is fundamentally identified with the heterosexual pattern of life. The non-gay homosexual feels his personal progress to be deeply encumbered by his same-sex attractions. Clearly, there are such people. What I want to suggest is that the vast majority of quote-unquote overweight and obese individuals in America today, at least among women, because this is so strongly gendered, could be called non-fat obese people in a way that's analogous to the notion of the non-gay homosexual. In other words, these are people who are fat, but who reject the notion that fatness is actually something that is inherent to their identity. It's a transitory state that they are going to change soon, or hope to. And just what they need, of course, is they need conversion therapy. They need reparative therapy. They need to be changed into someone who is different in this way from the person that they are right now, but they want to make that change. Why do they want to make that change? Well, it would be, I think, the crudest sort of reductionism to say that they are choosing to make that change or desiring to make that change because they live in a culture which basically condemns them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in regard to this particular characteristic that they have, and so and punishes them economically and socially, and naturally, I should say, not naturally, of course, is a tricky term, but predictably, they have a desire to change. Here's a few of the suggestions that Nicolozi makes in regard to the interventions that we ought to undertake to turn the non-gay homosexual into a person who does not practice homosexuality. 1, participate in sports activities. 2, avoid activities considered of interest to homosexuals, such as art museums, opera, symphonies. 3, avoid women unless it is for romantic contact. Go ahead and laugh, but you're not going to be laughing in a minute. Maybe you will, but whatever. 4, increase time spent with heterosexual men in order to learn to mimic heterosexual male ways of walking, talking, and interacting with other heterosexual men, etc., etc. Sounds funny, huh? Think about what people are counseled to do in order to lose weight. Don't hang around with your fat friends. They've got bad habits. Don't do the stuff they do. You'll end up fat like them. Avoid activities considered of interest to fat people, such as what? Video games, watching TV, eating. I'm sure many of you can draw lots of other analogies on your own. Avoid dangerous food situations. Avoid hunger. Because we're watching a lot of reality TV lately for purely sociological purposes. And I noticed that there's a new genre of Weight Watchers commercials in which a woman is actually battling hunger, who is personified as this, monstrous fuzzy little creature who's lurking around every corner, waiting to assault her with this horrible perversion called being hungry, which you should never experience if you are sufficiently vigilant in terms of monitoring yourself. Should never be hungry, just as the non-gay homosexual should learn not to feel sexual desire, at least not inappropriate sexual desire. What other analogies can we draw here? Think about arguments about whether same-sex sexual orientation is a chosen state versus an inherent state. Something that is of tremendous political controversy in the culture, in this culture right now. Same argument all the time in regard to fatness. People choose to be fat. The notion that people choose to be gay is in many social contexts, including, I think I can venture to say this one, considered extremely questionable at best. But the notion that people choose to be fat is met with much, much more receptiveness. Why? How much evidence is there that people actually choose to be fat in the sense that it's a volitional state for them in a meaningful kind of way? I would suggest that the evidence is no better than the evidence that, that same-sex sexual orientation is chosen. It's not as if no one ever chooses same-sex sexual orientation in any sense. It's not as if no one ever chooses being fat in some sense. It's just that the extent to which they do is tremendously exaggerated in certain cultural contexts. The cultural context of the exaggeration of the volitional character of sexual orientation tends to be a context of cultural conservatism, especially one with a heavily religious element. The cultural situation in which there's a tremendous exaggeration of which the extent that higher body weight is a chosen state is the completely mainstream culture of America today. Right? So people choose to be fat, and that's taken as a sort of platitudinous truth by people who would otherwise, in other situations, be very receptive to structural accounts of how, no, people aren't choosing, that's ridiculous, they're not choosing that, but somehow we're all choosing to be fat. Treatment versus acceptance. The notion that we need to treat people with same-sex sexual orientation has become extremely controversial and, in fact, derided in many, many social contexts. The notion that we should just leave fat people alone is considered radical. Why is that? Why is it that something that seems to be, given this, the empirical situation, relatively non-controversial, which is, being fat is for the most part not really actually bad for your health, and in any case, even if it was, we can't do anything about it, so why don't you just stop hassling people? Why is that proposition so controversial? Why is that just unacceptable? Consider how ineffective the treatments are. The ineffectiveness of conversion therapy for same-sex sexual orientation is well established. It doesn't work. The ineffectiveness of dieting and other weight loss interventions for weight loss, significant long-term weight loss purposes is also equally established. It doesn't work. The parallel there is quite strong. Furthermore, the only way it does work in each case, and here the parallel I think is really interesting, is you just water down the definition of success to a point where you can actually claim something. So for instance, in the context of conversion therapy, it's not as if the person stops feeling sexual desire for people of the same gender. It's not as if the person stops engaging in sexual practices with persons of the same gender. It's if the person is capable at minimal level of actually engaging in some kind of heterosexual sexual contact, that's a cure. And the analogy here with the diet industry and the public health industry and the weight loss industry and the obesity mafia is if you lose 5% of your body weight, that's a cure. You still may be technically obese, but just a little bit of weight loss is going to be beneficial to you supposedly. And so if you lose a little bit of weight, you're succeeding. If you have sex with an opposite gender person like once in a while at least, we've cured you. As the frustration over the failure to cure grows, the treatments become more radical. Here's some of the treatments that have been used to cure people of same-sex sexual orientation. One of the earliest interventions was not Britney Spears, whoever that is. One of the earliest interventions was Eugene Steinack, a colleague of Freud's, who Freud greatly admired, who transplanted the testicles of straight men into gay men. Guess what? It didn't work. Edmund Burglar, who was the leading proponent of conversion therapy in the 1950s in the United States, at a time when conversion therapy, by the way, was absolutely accepted as the appropriate treatment for the disease of homosexuality in the psychiatric community, he used confrontational therapy in which gay people were punished in order to make them aware of their masochism, supposedly. He openly violated professional ethics to achieve this, breaking patient confidentiality, to discuss the cases of patients with other patients. He bullied them, he called them liars, telling them that they were worthless. He insisted that gay people could be cured, and if they believed they should be accepted, they were asking for punishment, which confirmed their pathological immaturity. He initially blamed those who mistreated gay people because it provided a rationale for their masochistic view of the world. Imagine that. But from the 1950s on, after the emergence of the gay rights movement, he began to blame homosexuals for their own oppression. He had many fights with Alfred Kinsey because Kinsey presented homosexuality as an acceptable way of life, but Kinsey was a radical figure in the 1950s. Well, the analogies here are striking. Let me read you just, I realize I'm just about out of time, and we have to have some conversation before my head actually explodes and talking about this stuff. Here's a passage that was just published last week in a medical journal on how to treat the detrimental health effects of obesity stigma, which, by the way, are pretty well established. That calling people fat and shaming them and making them feel terrible about their bodies is really quite bad for people's health. Quote, "Obesity has become a pandemic affecting adults and children around the world. Considerable medical, scientific, and lifestyle-related knowledge and resources are being channeled into the identification of strategies to combat this major public health problem. Despite these multiple, just consider the turn that takes place at this point in the discourse. Despite these multidisciplinary efforts, however, little attention has been paid to the damaging social and psychological consequences of obesity. Many people with overweight and obesity frequently face stigmatization, prejudice, and discrimination because of their body size and shape, with disturbing and potentially harmful implications for their emotional and physical health and well-being." Think about the cognitive dissonance that has to be going on in your brain to be able to string those sentences together. You have a horrible disease that is going to cause this huge health crisis and is causing it right now, even though we don't actually have any evidence of that, is actually happening. But if people make you feel bad about yourselves in some way, that's very, very bad. That shouldn't be happening. Well, why are we stigmatizing you just because you're horribly diseased with a disease that you could cure if you had a little bit more self-control? I don't get it. That's a sign of a cultural discourse that has just sort of spiraled out of control in terms of its own contradictions. I have many, many other things to say, but